Good afternoon, good mid-afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to start by finishing the last topic from Chapter 8, which is the evil of the initiation of force, and then devote the rest of the time to Chapter 9, entitled Happiness. Now, looking at the section on force, the best structural idea of the present chapter on virtue was to put the topic of the initiation of force in that chapter. All the other virtues self-evidently belonged, and I just followed Ayn Rand's order. But there was a question as to where exactly the topic of force hierarchically belonged, whether it belonged here under the broad discussion of ethics or under government in connection with the topic of rights, with force as being the violation of rights and therefore as being improper. And I had thought about that and discussed that, as a matter of fact, with Miss Rand, and she agreed strongly that the issue of force is much broader than politics. It's much broader and prior to the topic of individual rights. The principle of the non-initiation of force applies before there's any government. Even if there were two men on a desert island where there was no question of organized society or of defining individual rights, it would still be a principle that survival by force is evil. Because the essence of such survival is one man choking the mind of another and trying to survive as an animal. So the topic is far broader than individual rights. Hierarchically, therefore, it doesn't go in the base of ethics, obviously, but it would have to go with all of these derivative virtues. Why do I put it at the end of the chapter? Because force represents an assault on rationality as such, and therefore on every virtue. It's not simply an attack on independence or integrity or productiveness. It's an attack on the human means of survival as such in every form. And therefore the logical place to put it is, this is rationality, the base. Here now is all the concrete virtues that it consists of, and here is the one thing that's aimed to destroy everything that we have just said, that actually stops the faculty of thought at its root and therefore paralyzes all virtues. And that's why this is the end, and that's stated on page 369 here. The key point there is the man of force. This is paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The man of force in attacking a person's body or seizing his property thereby negates and paralyzes his victim's mind. Now there is a certain paradox there, because if man has two attributes, you wonder how could it be that in attacking his physical body or his physical possessions, you are thereby negating or paralyzing his other attribute, his mind. And yet that is the essence of what force does. There's no other way to get to a mind except through a body. You cannot force a mind directly, only through doing something to the body, or including the brain, or the possessions. And then the following paragraphs, which I won't recapitulate, give you the essence of it. The mind is a certain kind of faculty, a cognitive faculty. Its function is to perform certain processes, always in obedience to reality. Those processes are not subject to coercion. They have to be performed. All of this is material covered earlier in the book, volitionally, egoistically, by a sovereign consciousness. To try to inject force into that process is to prevent the faculty from functioning. To prevent it from functioning as a rational faculty, which means to stop man's means of survival. The thing can still daydream. The mind can still daydream. It can still fantasize. It can still, spin its wheels in a way detached from reality. But so long as it's under a gun and told, think this or do this, the tie between it and reality is cut, and it's no longer a cognitive faculty. I think perhaps the best way to, the best sentence I have in this whole sequence is on 370, paragraph 2 there. When reality is decreed at gunpoint to be out of bounds, a rational mind has no way to proceed. That is, there's no way to function when you say reality is out. Now go ahead and come to this conclusion or that. You simply cannot do it because the essence of cognition is to try to come to conclusions with your eye on reality. The essence of a gun or any act of compulsion is to say, reality is out. Pay no attention to that. Well, if you are rational, you have to stop dead. And of course, if you're not rational, it doesn't make any difference what conclusions you're talking to, because you're not talking about a cognitive process. So that what really the people who advocate force are trying to do is get you to agree to accept an irrational epistemology. They want you to evade reality, deny your senses, refuse to integrate, only they think they'll get you to do it by an act of will. Well, if you could do it, all you would do is have the same bad consequences as you would have if you did it voluntarily. You'd detach your mind from reality and no longer be able to reach rational, integrated conclusions. So force is in effect the attempt to get you to adopt a corrupt epistemology. And it's wrong because you need a rational epistemology to know reality. So you see, the essence of the issue of force is what is reason, how does it function, and what is required if it's to know reality. The essence of the evil of force goes back to epistemology. So you can see from this how insane it would be to say, I'm starting a philosophy, and my axiom is the evil of the initiation of force. My axiom, that's my first proposition. Well, how can it be? Why would it be evil to initiate force? Why? Well, because presumably you don't like it. Why don't you like it? I don't know, I just don't like it. So that's what the libertarian position amounts to. We don't want force. Why? Well, somebody once said you shouldn't. That's it, they have nothing to say. Whereas force is just a self-evident consequence of what a proper epistemology requires, then force is its antonym. But they throw out epistemology, they throw out reason, they throw out the whole essence of objectivity, and then say, now let's start a social system or a philosophy with the evil of force, as though there's anything evil about force under those conditions. Now, I developed this, I think, quite well. There's a good formulation right near the bottom of 370 that the advocates of force try to turn a volitional process into a deterministic response, or an action into a reaction. Instead of thought being something you initiate by an act of will, they want thought to be something they can press a button and demand that you initiate and carry out as they wish just by reaction to their stimulus. And that, of course, is a violation of the essential volitional nature of human consciousness. What else? On 372, that top paragraph, I show how it applies, the top two paragraphs, how it violates every virtue. Not only rationality, but since the virtues are all interconnected, every virtue. So it's another case of the integration of virtues. And then on 373, if I say so myself, I have a very good statement. This is after that long paragraph near the top part about the three characters from We the Living Under Dictatorship, and what Ayn Rand means by the forcibly mindless, and that nothing any of them does can be right, since they've renounced the root of virtue, nor can any object they go through the motions of trying to get be a good. And then I like this line, the terminology of self-preservation is not applicable when the self has disappeared. The self being the mind, and what's the terminology of self-preservation? What are the words that I have in mind as being the terminology of self-preservation? At the very back. No, I've got two words. I've got specific language. Terminology. The words associated with self-preservation. Now, I'm trying to cash in on something and see if you know what it is. Yes?
Right and good.
Right and good, absolutely. I've already said the concept of value presupposes the concept of life. Value has to be valued to a living organism for its own well-being. So I've already established that all evaluative, and then within that a subdivision, all moral terms pertain to self-preservation. So now I don't even have to explain, hopefully what I'm alluding to now. I say none of those terms, right and good, can be used anymore because this person no longer has the mind, the means of self-preservation, and consequently we can't use any of the terms that describe something as for or against your life, namely right and good. Now, what philosopher is the next paragraph directed against? Do you know? Yeah, that was my answer to Plato. They were in the Republic, you know, where he's got, I'll have to put this down here, where he has the omnipotent philosophers who oversee everything, and they give tests to everybody to determine what course of life he's best fitted for, so they know better than anyone where he will best achieve fulfillment, social and personal, and then they assign everyone his career. So I was trying to work out a Platonic example to show that even if they chose right, they were wrong. There's no way to choose force rightly. Even if the content of the choice was right, the fact that it's force made it wrong. And I worked out in little detail there why the only thing that you would do is destroy that boy and make him end up hating the very thing that you prescribed. And then we draw the conclusion that just as force and mind are opposites, force and value are opposites. And what should that remind you of from our discussion of honesty? We said fraud and value are opposites. You can't gain a value by fraud. And we're making exactly the same point here now with regard to force. You can't gain a value by force. The act of force takes it outside the realm of value. So this is merely another concrete that we have already discussed. And there's a good summary of the broader point on 374, paragraph 5. Value, like truth, is contextual. Neither one can be divorced from a mind's knowledge and judgment. That is why whatever the force wielders decree, it is wrong. No value can be achieved by an assault on the valuer. No creative result by the agencies of destruction, no good by the methods of evil. And that should echo back to the discussion of honesty, where we said the end does not justify the means, and a corrupt means, in fact, detaches the end from the realm of evaluation. And then there's just, this detailed clarification of what is force, because the word is so misused and abused today. And the thing you have to ask is, does a given act attack a person's body or negate his mind? If it doesn't do that, if it doesn't literally prevent his mind from function, if it merely upsets, disappoints, angers, or whichever, frustrates, but he's still able to think and physically to act, it's not force. Force is only when it's directly an attack against the body or property, and the result is to stop within that context the functioning of the mind. Now, it went through various instances of that, but you know, of course, that you will be told that an employer forces you to take a certain salary, or that you're forced to move to California with your firm because you can't keep the job otherwise, or George Reisman forces you to take this trek to La Jolla, and you'd much rather stay in Santa Barbara or whichever. All of those are completely corrupt uses, because there's no attack on you, and you're still entirely free to think. There's many things they may do to you, these people. They upset you, they frustrate you, they make you miserable, but that's not to do with force. All right, that's basically what I had to say about force. Now, who has anything they want to say or ask about force before we go on?
As far as physical force is concerned, what's the difference between assault and battery and a boxing match?
What's the difference between assault and battery and a boxing match? That is already asking me a specialized question within the philosophy of law, which I'm happy to say is not my field. I do not know, and I have no obligation to know. I can only point out to you one difference. In assault and battery, one person is definitely not willing. Now, in boxing, the two of them get up together and punch each other. Now, there is a question there, a question you could raise, that if one is inflicting actual bodily harm on another, can a government honor a contract in which actual physical harm is being perpetrated by one against another? That's a question. It would be tantamount to if I said to you, I'll give you $100 if you let me lock you up for the rest of your life. And you say, okay, my child is starving. Here, I give him $100 and I lock you up in a closet and I leave. And then you start screaming and I say to the government, what can I do? We have a contract. She's doomed for life. She sold her right to liberty. Now, a government could not sanction such a contract. If rights are inalienable, even you can't give them up. So you can make a point that when something does involve the violation of, for instance, of liberty or of your physical well-being, you can't agree now to give it up, except in a certain context. You certainly, for instance, have a right to suicide. You certainly have a right to an assisted suicide if you can prove that you are voluntarily involved in it. I'm an absolutely passionate advocate of the right to suicide and the right to help in committing suicide. I think that's a logical corollary of your right to life is your right to terminate. But you see, you have to define these things tremendously carefully, including boxing, because you can't expect to have an objective government and tell them rights are not an absolute. The citizens can juggle them and trade them back and forth as they wish. So if you see drive by in a police car and you see one guy punching the face mercilessly of another, and you know his teeth are coming out all over, there's no use if the friend comes up and says, okay, they've agreed, here's a contract, you know, because they can, you know, get away with murder. So you have to define what is implicit in a right and what is a violation of a right that you may do, but not expect the government to have cognizance of. And I couldn't say for certain in a boxing match if it gets bloody enough. You know, at a certain point it's skill, and there's, you know, there's a certain harm incident to skill that's okay. But when it becomes an out-and-out slaughter, I don't completely disapprove of people who say it should be outlawed, simply on the grounds of preserving the objectivity of government. Please don't ask me any more on that. I now have told you more than I know on that topic. Now, the lawyers are having a meeting. That's just the kind of thing that they like and know something about. It's on both counts of which I disqualify. Yeah.
Yes, could you compare your discussion of force here with the discussion of force in golf speech in the context of a mystic feeling the need to force consciousness of others by flattery?
Oh, well, the quote that you give from Galt's speech about a mystic feeling the need to force others is a psychological analysis. Galt's speech includes motivation. It includes what is it that a mystic has done. It's kind of like a philosophical psychology. What is it that a mystic has done in growing up when he came to certain crossroads and so on to get him to the point where he feels this passion to have lust, the lust to have power over others. I deliberately omitted all of that. I tried to give the purely philosophical case for the evil of force, or the case against force, without any reference to why a person would want to. The only extent to which I approach that is, again, purely philosophically. If you hold intrinsicism and subjectivism, then you will be led to the necessity of force, you see. But that was a purely philosophic deduction. So Ayn Rand had a much more ambitious project, because she not only wanted the presentation of a philosophy, but to make comprehensible why the whole world has been in the grip of an alien one. I made a much less ambitious attempt here. It wasn't to explain its rejection, but just to get it out and say this is what it is, you see. That's basically the difference. And that gave me a chance to chew the details of the philosophy more, but as a result of giving up many other dimensions such as that, for instance. Diana.
Parents who destroy his child's ability to use his mind, perhaps by forcing him to learn over and over again and vicious, mystical epistemology. Is that specifically initiation?
No. The teaching of wrong ideas is never the initiation of force if it's not accompanied by physical torture. If a parent instills in a child, I gather you mean something like a religious epistemology, and there's commandments and revelations, and he scares him about tales of the supernatural and so on. That is not force at all. That is irrationality. It's vicious because the child has no recourse at that age. He's got to suffer through it, in effect turn neurotic, be hopelessly confused and miserable, and then one day dig his way out of it if he can find access to something more rational. But to do something to a child who has no recourse does not yet make it force. Force to a child is like to an adult, although it's proper in many cases to a child. As you have to pick him up bodily, you have to punch him. Child abuse is force. Locking a child in his room and not letting him go is force. I don't say that's necessarily wrong in every case, locking him up, but that is force. Taking his teddy bear away from him and saying, that's it, you're never getting it again. That's force against his property. Now, parents have no alternative but to use some force in dealing with the child for the same reason that they have to use force in dealing with animals, that the children are not open to reason. And you have the responsibility to make this kid do something, and he insists on playing in the middle of Times Square. So you have to just grab him bodily off of Times Square. You cannot deal with the child purely by reason. But the idea is you minimize the force to life-threatening situations or to situations where you really want the punishment to stand out. And of course, you don't engage in bodily harm or child abuse or that type of thing. But force has to be specific. It's not any bad thing you do to someone that they can't escape. It has to be some actual impetus directed to the body or the property. Did you follow that? Yes.
Under the first alternative, that can happen overall instead of saying until such time as they
Oh, well, if you want that wording on 373, he may attempt to flee the country, put in the broadest possible terms, it has to include, yes, go underground, escape, flee into a cellar, into Anne Frank's attic, wherever you can to get out of the reach of the dictators. Flee in that sense means get out of their reach. This was just the obvious example of it. Yeah. Okay. No. It's not, notice, the child is punished for not acting in what he's taught. That's a prerogative of a parent. That's force, obviously. The ability to punish is the ability to force, to take away something, restrict his, what they call ground him, etc. Whatever you do, hit him, those are all physical. But those are within the prerogatives of a parent. It's not to say that they're necessarily moral. They may be teaching him bad things, and they may be punishing him severely when they shouldn't be at all. But that is force, but that doesn't mean that every act of force by a parent is wrong. A child is not entitled to say no initiation of force, not until he brings open his home, his own paycheck. At that point, he takes his own apartment, and good luck to him. Yes. Right. Well, that doesn't prove anything. There's been very little thought. You say throughout history there's been very little freedom, a great deal of coercion, and doesn't that refute the idea that you cannot think under force? No, it doesn't. Correlatively, if you correlate the two, the periods of greatest freedom were the periods of greatest thought. Such as ancient, let me finish now, I got your question. Such as ancient Greece or the Renaissance of the 19th century. But I don't want you to misinterpret this, because I put, this is one of the few passages in which I kept repeating the context in the sentence, so you wouldn't drop it. Now, for instance, do I believe that Galt has turned into an idiot when he's tortured? He's just, he's like a vegetable. He no longer has the capacity to think. Obviously not. I didn't say any such thing, and to say he can't think is if you look at the very sentence on page 370, paragraph 4, I did not say the point is that he cannot perform the processes essential, that he cannot think. I said the point is that qua enslaved. Now these, I tried to omit all qualifications in these sentences. So if a qualification survived, then it was saying something. And this means, in the moment that Galt, for instance, is being enslaved, so far as he's being enslaved, in other words, they tell him, find a way to save the country. And he knows there is no way. And the gun is at him, and they say, think about it. He literally cannot. Now, if they said to him, how much is 2 and 2? He could say 4. He could go through the multiplication table, because they are not then trying to get him to depart from reality. Or if they just leave the room, you know, he could recite Gray's Elegy and start analyzing it literarily. He's got all his intellectual capacity, but he can't think insofar as he is the object of a gun, you see. Now, I even put in parentheses there that he can still smuggle into his life an element of secret thought. If his captors leave him alone, I mean, if they're continuously torturing him, he can't do even that. And if he doesn't try to express his thought in reality. So to say he can't think does not mean he loses the faculty of thought. What it does mean, though, is that if a whole society is controlled and ruled by force from the beginning, most people will never even develop the faculty of thought. They will be brought up with the idea of just acceptance and regurgitation of what they're told, and it will take a tremendous act of initiation, a revolution historically, for someone to start having some private thought. And he will be cut down, usually right away. And that's why you'll have century after century after century of stagnation. As, for instance, from the fall of the ancient world until, with 1 or 2 exceptions, until you get 1,000 years later. So it's true, but it's not true in the way you tried to take it to mean. Now, I think we should give happiness at least a bit of a hearing here. So let's go on, and then you can come back to force if you want. These are all good questions, but it's also true that I have done force at a previous TJS, so for what it's worth. Now, we turn to chapter 9, and let me start by making a few remarks on how the idea of a chapter on happiness ever occurred to me to begin with. Well, I knew that you would have to end ethics on the topic of pleasure or happiness. Why was that unavoidable? And it's the final reward and result, right? So, but the thing that stopped me, frankly, with doing just that, just, happiness as the reward, was that that's a little too short for a whole chapter. And I find that there's no conflict between what a book requires and what thought requires. They both work in units. And if you have 50, 60, 100-page units and suddenly there's a 10-page unit, there's something wrong with your thinking that you only need 10 pages. You're not organizing. So I thought I might slip happiness in. Virtue is already so long. I stick the whole thing on happiness, being the reward of virtue, as just a little tail end. But I had force as the tail end. So I could only have so many tails. So I looked around and I realized I still had 2 miscellaneous topics. Now, by miscellaneous topics, I mean topics that I had tried to get in for maybe the last 100 pages. And every time I put them in, I couldn't, they just wouldn't write in that section. They wouldn't tie into anything, so I put them on and said, okay, I'll do that later. Now I was at the end of ethics, so anything that was miscellaneous and left over, I either had to find out it really belonged earlier, or I find a way to stick it in here. Now, one of the ones waiting was the moral and the practical. My first thought was to put that in chapter 7. We start off there saying why we need morality as a guide to action and so on. I thought, well, maybe I'll put right in there. If that's what morality is, it must be practical. And get rid of it before I even get to ethics. But it seemed awfully theoretical and rationalistic, that we won't even yet at that stage know the details of what being moral consists of, and we're already establishing that it's practical. So it seemed that I was jumping the gun, but it didn't go in after any given virtue. because why that virtue rather than some other? Then I thought maybe I would stick it back, way back in chapter 4. I have a section on theory and practice, and this sounds a lot like that, the moral and the practical. It's just the practical application of the other, but theory and practice itself was an interjection, and it just couldn't sustain another one. So I figured if this is going to be a properly inductive approach, in other words, the facts first and then the conclusion, this has got to come after virtue. So somehow the moral and the practical has to go in with the same topic as pleasure and happiness, but I didn't yet see how. And then the last thing I had waiting was sex. I tried from I don't know how long to get that in. And I thought at one point, well, maybe this is really psychology and doesn't belong in philosophy, and that's why. But obviously I couldn't get away with that. It was too obviously philosophical. I tried making it as a subdivision under certain virtues, particularly the one treating of self-esteem. So I tried to put it under pride, but it made sex much too solitary and self-preoccupied. So I sat there trying to wonder what to do, and finally it struck me, first of all, that the moral and the practical is the same topic from another aspect as happiness. Now, what is the common denominator between? The moral is the practical, and happiness is the norm. It's been one word. Well, you can use two if you want, but this is what struck me. Yeah. No, not just purpose. They both involve purpose, but the idea that you not only pursue your purpose, but you achieve it. In other words, success. The common denominator of those two ideas is success. Success in the pursuit of values. The moral practical principle tells you if you pursue the right values, you will succeed, you will be practical. And happiness tells you if you pursue the right values, you will gain pleasure, you will enjoy life. So they both pertain to the reward, and the reward of virtue is, in this broad sense, success. And then, to bring sex into this picture? All you have to do is realize, and that's what struck me, that it is not really a different issue from happiness, speaking philosophically. It is a form of happiness. Not just an activity that leads to happiness, but it itself is a form of happiness. The reason I say this is that I regard intense pleasure as being the essence of sex, not as being merely a derivative, occasional attribute, but as being inherent in the phenomenon. I could imagine many descriptions of sex, but I would hear the statement, sex is very boring, as a self-contradiction. Whatever that person is talking about or referring to, unless he's going to needless linguistic exchange, but if he really means that he experiences sex the same way you experience the multiplication table in grade 3, then I would say whatever that is, it's not essentially similar to what most people know when they talk about sex. So it's essentially a kind of pleasure, and it is a metaphysical pleasure, which is what happiness is. So by the time I taught myself to this point, that it would be a positive crime not to treat sex and happiness right together because they are so obviously belong. So I ended up now with this threefold chapter. The moral, the practical, that paves the way. Why a certain code of behavior, which we've just described, is necessary for the successful achievement of value. And then, the state of successful achievement is happiness, and then the climax of happiness is sex. And it becomes a perfect, hierarchically sound structure made up out of leftovers. And I was very pleased, to get that out of what I had there, notes and fragments that I couldn't use. This was a uniquely enjoyable chapter to write because of of course the subject, but the language you know, you always look up in thesaurus and dictionaries and so on. And for instance, in chapter 3 on concept formation, I was constantly trying to figure out what's the difference between measurement, quantity, amount, magnitude. And it's excruciating, unpleasant technicality. But here I was looking up rapture versus ecstasy, exaltation. And a philosopher just does not get to write about such things very often. All right, now let's look at the first sequence on the mind-body, the moral practical. And there's a good statement of the irrationality of this dichotomy on page 380. And in fact, I will make a boast after I read you this. On page 380, the second paragraph, I'm stating the standard, you know, idealism, realism dichotomy, and then I summarized the last sentence there. The alternative is be good without earthly purpose. That's the idealist who disdains practicality. Or seek ends while ignoring the necessary means. In other words, dispensing with virtues, principles, absolutes, etc. In other words, commit yourself to virtues or to values, to causes or to effects, to ethics or to life. And after I read Galt's speech, just after it was published, I said to Ms. Rand, don't they really give you a choice using her definition? I said, using your definition of virtue and value, that you have to choose virtue or value. And she looked as the only time in 30-odd years she ever said that to me. She said, if I had thought of that, I would have put that in Galt's speech. Which is, to me, you know, that was fabulous. However, that happened in 58 and never again. But that's, I think, is a good statement if you follow it up to now of the complete bizarre idea of the moral or the practical. And that, of course, was the question that I first came to Ayn Rand to answer. You know that question that I asked her. I couldn't understand Howard Rourke because I knew you had to be either moral or practical, and he seemed to be both. So which did she intend him to be? And you can just imagine what she told me. Now, the consequence of, I'm just hitting a few high points here, the consequence of the moral being the practical is the negative corollary. The immoral is the impractical, or what Ayn Rand called the impotence of evil. And there's a good, the second last paragraph on 382. The corruption that we have today, that people automatically associate evil with value. Now, if you're an objectivist, evil suggests to you harming yourself, destroying yourself, failing to gain a value, thwarting, losing. Evil automatically should be associated with loss and harm. But of course, on the ethics of self-sacrifice, evil has all the glamour and efficacy of anything that's practical, and so you associate any value with evil, however absurd. And then I think it's a very good integration that I gave these three standard examples from different fields, and they're all the same fundamental error. They all come from the equation of evil and value. That is, the mad scientist who gains new knowledge because he's diabolical. So his evil is what makes him able to penetrate the frontiers of the unknown. The robber baron is rich, and what makes it possible is that he's a wicked. He's an exploiter. So it couldn't be anything good or productive. It has to be something wicked because value has to be associated with evil. Or the materialist, the lustful materialist who enjoys sex because he's only an animal. And again, it's the same idea. If you used your higher faculties, well then, of course, you would go into a convent or a nunnery. But only an animal would be able to experience joy. So they take all these major values, knowledge, wealth, pleasure, and claim that they are the problems of vice. And so it's essential that that whole idea be crushed. And that's, of course, one of the major achievements of Ayn Rand, to blast that whole idea. One of her biggest revolutions is the idea of the impotence of evil. Not just what evil is, but that it is metaphysically helpless to accomplish anything except as a parasite living on the good. And that's the whole idea behind the strike. They're going to throw off evil once and for all by not letting it feed on their achievements. They'll just leave the evil to its own devices, and of course the whole thing collapses. So the whole book is basically motivated by, if you want to look at it this way, the moral and the practical and the impotence of evil. That's what the strike pivots on. Now, why was there any plausibility to so false an idea as that evil is potent? That I cover briefly on 384. I'm passing by that nice paragraph of all those different kinds of road paving. Those are fun paragraphs to write because you deliberately take things from all over the place and stick them all together in one, so you get a sense of the vast panorama of the evil you're talking about. And in there somewhere is the head of the Judiciary Committee, who stole a speech from the British Labour. That happened right at the time that I was writing this paragraph. Biden, yeah, where is that? Somewhere in there. It's somewhere in there. Or maybe it's in another paragraph. Oh no, he's on 382. The political candidate who seeks a reputation for eloquence through plagiarism then sees his candidacy collapse when his sources are discovered. That is who I had in mind, because I was just getting the examples out of the newspaper at that point. Anyway, the point here is that why there's any plausibility to such an idea as the potency of evil, and that is because of the blood transfusion. The sanction of the victim, the errors on the part of men who are essentially good but don't understand their own rights and rightfulness, and consequently they transfuse their power willy-nilly to the other side. And that's, of course, you know all this from Atlas Shrugged. And then, going to the deepest issue, why does the whole moral practical dichotomy exist? How could people tolerate it? Now, you see, that, as asked, could be a psychological question, but I'm asking purely philosophically. What kind of philosophy would make possible the whole mind-body dichotomy? Deeper than just ethics, deeper than self-sacrifice or anything of that kind, since ethics itself rests on metaphysics and epistemology. And I think I take you very well, if I say so myself, through the steps on 385, that it comes first of all to scorn for principles, and therefore the ones who embrace principles say, don't worry about being practical, just cling to your noble truths, and you'll be rewarded in another dimension. And the other side says, we want to live in this world, and therefore to hell with principles. So they become the unprincipled pragmatists. And then how do you explain this kind of scorn for principles? Since an objectivist would regard that as impossible. And of course, that comes down to what? As everything else does, a theory of concepts. So if you detach concepts from reality, then of course you're going to end up with the moral versus the practical. But Ayn Rand does not, and I brought it right back to the axioms in the last sentence of the sequence on 386, which is a good sentence. Morality is practical because consciousness is practical. Now that is a perfect statement for objectivism, because what is morality according to objectivism? Well, how do you adhere to reality? Yeah, using your consciousness to perceive reality. That's what morality is. So if its consciousness is practical, because it's the only way you get to know reality, then, of course, morality must be practical. There can't be any dichotomy, because morality is the injunction, use your consciousness. Or not the injunction, but that's what virtue amounts to. Now, how do we know consciousness is practical? How do we know consciousness will enable us to achieve that which we're after? That's what practical means. Because it's, quote, the faculty of perceiving that which exists. But how can it be the faculty of perceiving that which exists, since it works basically through concepts, and concepts have no reference in reality? So you see, there's no way out. There's only a theory of concepts makes possible this whole approach. Okay, let's stop there for some questions.
Given the rational choice, based on the depth of one's judgment of the desirable approach to the male-female relationship, do you anticipate that somebody falling in love is one of the ways in becoming a relative of vital earth?
No. I think the question was something like this. Since you're supposed to be rational in falling in love, will the words falling in love go into disuse? Yeah, no. There's a lot of things you're supposed to do rationally that people will go on doing and talking about even if they're doing them irrationally. So I can't see a linguistic determinism of that kind. If people stopped using words for the actions that they take that were irrational, that would be a gigantic step forward. Because they'd stop doing them, because they'd stop thinking of them. Yes. On page 368, yes.
Non-automatic factors, non-automatic values. What are automatic?
I just can't find you. Oh, it's at the bottom.
What are automatic?
I don't see where you are. Oh, I see, yes. Yes, there are automatic, I see. It's the section on the initiation of physical force as evil, the bottom of 368, and then it's the first paragraph under that, the last line of that paragraph. I say the vice represents the destruction of rationality and therefore of every other virtue and every non-automatic value as well. Now she wants to know, I'm glad you asked that, because these words are theoretically everyone calculates. And a parenthesis should be omitted unless necessary. Can you think of values that plants, animals, and men are given automatically that require no choice and no voluntary action to gain? Breathing is a perfect example. Air. Now, your lungs, you can't suffocate yourself by will. And there are various things like that that you simply can't get away from. Animals are all like that, and plants. And the human body has many things also, which so long as it lives will go on functioning. Whatever, a scientist would give you the way all the inner processes would go, but they'll keep on doing it within the, until the entity dies. Force does not deplete the earth of air or stop the blood from flowing, or whatever goes on automatically is going to go on. What it does do is remove or sabotage anything that would be achieved by an act of choice. I'm glad you asked that, because there's a whole important automatic foundation of values and of cognition. The automatic foundation of values is everything that's biologically built into the organism, including man, without which you'd never get to higher level values. You'd first have to have the pleasure pain of that which is automatic. And what is the counterpart in epistemology? The automatic form of cognition, which is the direct reaction to reality without which you'd never get to the higher stage. Sense perception, exactly. So this is the same reason, if you can see it, as to why we don't say perceptions are objective. That's exactly the same issue. It's a good question. Okay. Are you going back to happiness?
No, of course.
Okay.
If I'm have a guy pointed gun at me, presenting with the message, of course.
Yeah.
And basically all he wants to do is he wants my wallet. Basically, he's impinging on my actions, and I have to give up something. But I don't quite see the connection where it's a small use of force like that, it's supposed to be dictatorship, stopping my mind here.
Well, I covered that, Phil, so I don't want to spend much time. That exact example is covered on page... No, I can't even find force. See, I know it the way I wrote it. I don't know this booklet that well. Give me 1 second. Where's the one with the wallet? Oh, 371, that's what I had. Oh, yes. Paragraph 3. Since man is an integrated being of mind and body, any attempt to force his mind necessarily represents an attempt to rule his actions, and vice versa. Any attempt to control his actions has to represent an attempt to force his mind. And then I explain in the next, read the next paragraph. Force makes a man act against his judgment. The victim still sees what he sees, values what he values, knows what he knows, but the forcer makes his cognition useless in practice, and therefore puts him in what position? That his own conclusions are impotent. He can think, but he can think in the same way only that you can fantasize about another dimension. It has no actual guidance in that situation. Now that doesn't mean in another situation it doesn't. It does mean, however, that a dictatorship which controls your actions in principle makes your thought useless as such. You can't take an integrated being and say, as to what your body does is up to me, but you're free to think about what and for what. I mean, it would be depriving any purpose from the thing. And I give a very good, actually, summary of this on 371, just the last 2 lines of the second last paragraph. In the one manifestation, that is, when you're using force to attack the mind, the brute works to detach his victim's consciousness from reality and therefore from life. In the other, when you're trying to attack his actions, you're detaching him from life, his consciousness from life and therefore from reality. Now, in both cases, if you delimit and the person is a criminal and you have the government on your side, then of course they stop it, rectify it, and you resume your capacity to think, or your capacity to act accordingly, but that doesn't change what the essence of the principle is. I want to go on back to happiness. We'll come back, but I have to keep a certain rate here. Let's go on 386, happiness as the normal condition of man. Now this is really the substance, because the preceding was, the moral and practical, was correcting basically errors on those topics that let you flow into this one. This is the essential content of the chapter, and the integration of them is the page 387, the third paragraph from the end. It is good. The moral, the practical, and the happy cannot be sundered. Now, this is absolutely, as far as I know, distinct to Objectivism, with the exception of some implications in Aristotle, but as an explicit statement, and certainly with this argument, by their nature the three form a unity. He who perceives reality, what's that? That's the moral, right? Is able to gain his end, what's that? The practical, and thus enjoy the process of being alive, the happy. Similarly, the evil, the impractical, and the unhappy form a unity. He who evades, the immoral, renders himself impotent in action, the impractical, and thus experiences life as suffering, the unhappy. So this is, as I say, maybe precedented in the Greeks, but for instance in Christianity, this is the complete antithesis. This would be horrendous from the point of view of Christianity, because you're supposed to suffer and turn away and turn the other cheek and give up in this life, so you'll be rewarded in the next one. But the idea of putting the moral, the practical, and the happy all together like that would be out of the question. Now, I called your attention on 388, the issue of motivation by love and motivation by fear. This is one of Ayn Rand's important distinctions, and these are some good examples on the difference between the two. This distinction is very similar to, what do they call it today? Defensiveness in psychology is motivation by fear versus, do they recognize healthy motivation? Healthy would be the positive. And if you want to know an example, or do you need one, of the presidential candidate who has something to say in a TV debate, who wants to make a case to the country and win the argument, versus the candidate who wants only not to make any mistakes on screen and not to lose, well, I don't think we have seen in our lifetime anything but the second. But if you want an immortal example of the second, I guess it was before your time. I can't figure out the dates right now. It was when Ford and Carter. When was that? So were you around then? They were debating on TV, and something happened to the sound of it. Whatever. The picture was still there, but the debate couldn't go on. And I think it was 27 minutes. I believe it was sometime like that. 20 minutes. They stood there like this, and neither one would move. They wouldn't sit down, nothing, because the first one that moved, what if that's the wrong thing to do? And it looks like, I'm the commander-in-chief, but I'm not in charge, and I'm not at the helm, and so on. And you could hear people saying around the country, the first one that sits down and says, this is ridiculous, will win the presidency. And they sat there motionless, stood there. And, and that is what I had in mind about it. They did not want to make any mistakes on screen. Now, on a more serious note, I want to call your attention to this paragraph from Ayn Rand, which has never been properly lectured on by me, and was sort of thrown in here. Unfortunately, should have been given more attention, and it's one of the things I simply could not find a way to give the right amount of space to. So I simply want to call out to you, this is one of the few places where I feel I have slighted a philosophically crucial point. And I mean this paragraph from Galt's speech, as I've excerpted it. Achieving life is not, on 388. Achieving life is not the equivalent of avoiding death, etc. Light is not the absence of darkness. An entity is not the absence of a non-entity. Building is not done by abstaining from demolition. Existence is not a negation of negative. Now that is a tremendously important paragraph. What actual branch of philosophy does that paragraph properly belong in, even given all of its examples? It belongs under metaphysics. It does not belong under happiness, that's for certain. Happiness is just one example of it, and it happens to be the only example I could deal briefly enough with. But I carried that paragraph around. I could not do it in chapter 1 because I didn't know how to make all those points clear way back in chapter 1, and by the time I could make it clear, I was so far from metaphysics, I lost my context anyway. So I never did solve the problem of how to treat this properly. But one of the reasons I want to get this material on tape, the comments I'm making, is that someday someone can write a revised version and correct the errors, or, the supplement or something. And this is one point where I feel I did not do her justice. Let me show you in what way this topic is much broader and much more important than happiness or even than ethics. It's every place where someone ascribes identity to something on the basis of the presence of a zero or the absence of a zero. It's what she elsewhere calls the reification of a zero. And then the absence of that reification is the failure to grasp the direct perceptual fact and what is, and when you point, what is the concept she often used to use to stand for what you get directly when you look at something? It is something. That's the idea of the positive. You can't point to the nothing. What's the closest you can do to get the concept of the nothing? You have to close your eyes. You look, something. Now you close your eyes and it's gone. But all that you have is the absence of some specific, defined something. It's there, and then it isn't. You do not have a special entity or the negation of an entity or any other thing before your eyes. It's just gone. That's what nothing means. Now, the failure to grasp this is just all the way through philosophy. For instance, I had a professor who used to hold that the essence of life of human being is that they're finite, which is true. And so he would say that proves the superiority of the negative over the positive. Now, do you know how? Well, the finite means he's, like, say, he's 6 feet, but not any longer. So the not is what limits him. If there was no not, he'd just go on being forever. See? So he's hedged in by knots. He does not have 6 kidneys. He does not have 4 noses. So he would say, for everything you can say he is, there's 100 things he is not. And that's what keeps him into this little square of what is. Therefore, he called that the metaphysical function of the not. Now that is the complete, this is not an aberration. I mean, it is, but it's a very popular one. This is the whole idea of negation as being a positive principle. Something out there. You know, Mr. Ang used to put it this way. What do you have left when you eat the donut? That's nothing. Now, you could get this in religion. You get this in religion all the time in the idea we have a higher description of God. We don't say, for instance, a low-level type says God is all-knowing. But if he's gone to school, you know, for a while, he knows there's 1,000 objections to saying that God is knowing and that you can't really use that word. And the same for God is powerful and God creates the world and so on. So he stops any description. And he says, God is the negation of all description. And you know what that's called? Negative theology. Negative theology is that what you rightfully and righteously say about God is, he is not A, he is not B, he is not C, and then they finish it as terrific. Now I got a much higher God than if, you know, he just had a few attributes, you know, in spades that human beings have too. But that is all elevating the negative to a higher dimension. Now Kant's revolution was to take the same primacy of the negative, the worship of the negative, and make it the rule of cognition. Because what is the true faculty of cognition according to Kant? No, it's not just human consciousness is no good. No consciousness is any good, right? Because they all have identity. So what kind of consciousness would be able to acquire knowledge? A consciousness which was nothing in particular, a non-consciousness. That would be the highest form of cognition. So what the old medieval mystics used to do for God, put him into the realm of negation, and what the existentialists do, you know, for das Nicht. Kant was the one who brought that into epistemology and made negation the essence of cognition. And therefore, of course, annihilated all cognition, just the way earlier religion had annihilated all reality. Now, if you come down to practical terms, when Mr. Thompson promised not to break Galt's bones, and he said that's not a reward. The removal of a negative is not a positive. That's the same exact principle, believe it or not. So Galt's refusal to submit to threats from Mr. Thompson is exactly the reason on which Ayn Rand rejects Kant and Christianity. Metaphysically and epistemologically, she would say it comes back to you either grasp what is or you don't. If you grasp what is, then you don't try to jump beyond it metaphysically, epistemologically, nor do you offer something other than that as an incentive to action. There is nothing, you see. Now, if I can quote him, I hope he doesn't, maybe he didn't have this in mind, but I thought of this the other night when I heard Professor Williams speak. His distinction between seduction and rape, as he used it, is the same distinction. Because in seduction, as he was using it, you offer somebody a positive. And rape was the threat, and then the promise was, I won't do it if you obey. So you're holding out the absence of a negative, you see. And he was absolutely right that is the distinction between private or government power, or economic or political power. It still comes back to the power of the positive or of withholding the negative. And if you grasp her statement here, that existence is not a negation of negatives, and if you see that, all the way through philosophy, it will give you, I think, a valuable perspective on this aspect. It really is a corollary of existence exists, but I still don't think I would put it in right after existence exists, because I'd have to get consciousness and identity and so on. So to this day, I don't know where it properly belongs, but at least wherever it belongs in exposition, it certainly is a corollary as far as its hierarchical status is concerned. And I just call it to your attention because it's a topic I did not exploit, and it would be great for somebody to write a treatise on, but I don't know who would publish it. Okay, we can take questions now on that section. A cat? Can infants or cats or non-rational beings be happy? Not in the sense that we are using it. Animals can experience pleasure at specific values, and they can experience some kind of animal, or in the case of a child, some kind of childlike contentment. But happiness is here used as a state of soul which essentially depends upon a developed conceptual consciousness. So there's even a question of at what age. Aristotle thought you wouldn't be happy till you die. And they could then look back and see, yes, you did achieve all your values, or no, you didn't. But I think that goes a little far. But I would say that I would not call an infant. I doubt that I would call a teenager happy unless he was tremendously precocious. He'd have to have a definite set of values that he was, and have established his basic relation to reality on the volitional level. He wouldn't yet have to have achieved professional or romantic or whatever success, but he'd have to know what he wants and have the basic orientation to reality. That's what I'd say on that. Well, is Winan aware that he's pursuing happiness when he's pursuing power? I don't think Winan is pursuing happiness. Now, Ayn Rand did not hold that every character or every human being automatically pursues happiness. That is a complex achievement. She depicts Winan as the man who is after power, but he's after power innocently, as she depicted it. So he's on the wrong path, but he's a man of honor. And when he's carried beyond a certain point, and when he sees where his course leads, and also that it doesn't help him get the goals he wants, then he renounces it and basically confesses that he failed. So he did not pick power as a means to happiness. He picked power as a means to protecting his value, you see. And he thought that you're in the kind of world where either the things you value, you cut everybody's throat to get to them, or they will cut yours. And therefore, he did it out of fidelity to that which he valued. I don't think in those terms the issue of happiness occurred to him. Or if it had, I don't want to speak for him, but he would have had to think something like, whatever happiness I'm going to have, this is the only way I can live, so it'll have to be an adjunct of this course of action. Now, Rourke was much more conscious about happiness, because he said to the dean, if you remember right at the beginning, I've got, so many years, and how will I ever be happy if I do the work that you want me to? But Winan, there was a desperation. You remember when he went up to the rooftop to decide what to do, he was driven by a torturous conflict. And so I don't think in that way that he pursued happiness. He didn't pursue suffering. He had something else that was in his mind primary, and then he just had to live with the consequences. It's not life or love. Yeah. I don't know what word you're using. L-O-V-E? Oh, life. Okay, yeah.
That the life of a rational man includes much more than biological pursuit.
Well, wait a minute. Let me stop you there, because you are dropping out hundreds of pages in that question. You're saying if the goal is self-preservation, don't I have to say the life of a rational man includes much more than biological continuance? Well, I've written hundreds of pages on what it includes. All of these different virtues, all of the values that they lead to, all of that being a means to life. And I have even got a passage directly on the point that you mentioned back in chapter 7 on why life does not mean merely life at any price. Now, where is that? It's under man's life as the... I just don't know this. I suppose it would be the same. Here, 304. Starting from the top, 1, 2, 3, oh dear, 4, 5, 6, 6, where it says the objectivist standard of morality, you see that? Is not a momentary or a merely physical survival. It's an integrated being of mind and body. You can't have a survival of one attribute without the other. It's the long-range survival of man, mind, and body. And then I go, the standard is not staying alive by any means, because long range is only one means. And we just had this whole discussion of principles, and then following this, there's an entire chapter on all of the moral virtues that subsumes. So at this stage of the game, you're hierarchically way out of context to ask me that question. I mean, you could ask that question only when I got out of my mouth for the first time, life is a standard, and then you could say, well, does that mean, because anything that keeps you alive, I say, well, just give me a minute and I'll elaborate, but you're 2 chapters late. Okay. No. I mean, as a sustaining life, humor is sustains lecture. Well, what is your question about humor? How does it relate to objectivism? Or what? I feel what I said. Humor has a definite role in education because everybody validly resents anybody else standing up there and talking indefinitely, no matter what they say. And therefore there's an inherent desire on the part of everybody to tune out. And consequently, you have to give them some kind of incentive to stay involved. And humor is one of the best, because for the moment of a laugh, they feel blessed relief, that it's not as bad as they thought, the time is passing, and it will be over. So I use it deliberately as much as I can. Now, you started your question by saying I didn't include it in the book. This was not a book on every subject Ayn Rand ever had a view on, or everything objectivism could be applied to. It was only the 5 branches of philosophy. And those have very definite topics, of which humor is not one. It's not the nature of reality, the means of knowledge, the values, of self-preservation, the function of the government, and the nature of art. That doesn't mean that humor doesn't have all kinds of legitimate roles and functions in life. But it's not a philosophic topic as such. Philosophy can be applied to it, as Miss Rand did. Now, she regards humor as being basically the denial of the reality of something. It was a way of taking away reality for something. So if you heard something absurd and you started to laugh, the idea was, that's fantastic. That's completely unbelievable. And she thought it was therefore very important at what you laughed. If you were laughing at the bizarre, at the contradictory, at the irrational, that's one thing. If you were laughing at the good, though, then she thought that was very wrong. And so she had, that's why she gave Toohey the injunction, teach people to laugh at everything, because inherently humor is destructive. It makes people reject something. Now, if you do that, just for a moment's relief from torture, like in a lecture, that's fine. But if you do it as a way of sneering at something that's actually good, then it's not. But that is not part of philosophy, and that's why I left it out. Now, I want to get sex in before we're out here. And that's the last sequence, and that's now way over on page, 392. And you see that it naturally follows from the above topics. Chapter 8 included self-esteem. The part on happiness includes the benevolent universe. So the celebration of both necessarily has to follow And I feel that it flowed absolutely inevitably, this topic. And Ayn Rand's definition, of course, is a celebration of self and of the world, of the universe. So it's like a celebration of self-esteem and benevolent universe. And I give just her standard doctrines here. The only point I want to stress or point out to you is on 392, the last long paragraph, the second sentence. I'm saying there's a biological basis of sexuality and a counterpart in the animal world, and then this very important statement. All animal needs and pleasures are transfigured in the context of the rational animal. All the things which are just physical in animals become largely spiritual in human beings. Now, somebody read an early copy of this, complimented me on that, said, what an interesting idea. How come no objectivist ever said that? So I want to tell you that Ayn Rand made that point to me explicitly on my second meeting with her in 1951, apropos of food. So this is not my original point, but it certainly is a very important point, because all these people who denounce it, sex as physical, it's exactly analogous to saying eating dinner is just physical, but it isn't, as I think anyone is able to assume. Now, this on page 393, this attack on Platonic love as being a breach of integrity, only Ayn Rand could be capable of a thought like that. This, by the way, is a very good statement of Rourke's that I personally feel was never properly appreciated in all the years of lecturing and commenting, and it's just sitting there in the fountainhead, and it's a perfect statement of the mind-body integration and what you should be doing in that regard. So I wanted that to be stressed. This little paragraph on 393 is absolutely true, word for word. As I asked her once, what does philosophy have to say about sex? And she says, sex is good. That's it. Now, I've been asked many times, so let me get rid of this one. On the bottom of 393, why did I include the chaser, the rapist, the adulterer, and the sadist, but not the homosexual? And I forget, there's several others that have been asked of me. And the answer is this. I included those ones which I regard as provably wrong by philosophy alone. I excluded those which I regard as provably wrong only by reference to specific sciences, usually psychology. So, for instance, in promiscuity is obvious. We're talking at the bottom of 393. Is a lack of value orientation. Coercion speaks for itself. Pretense. I do not, however, believe that homosexuality can be proven within philosophy itself. That's up to psychology, and I did not want, to put a whole bunch of dogma in here. I wanted only those examples that were clearly within the purview of philosophy as such. And then they go into intrinsicism and subjectivism and what they do. And I wanted to point out to you a typo. And here is a case where there is the absence of a negation. On 395, after the fifth paragraph, he earned what he has and he knows it. There should be a large blank space. That's the end of the discussion of sex. The rest is then the little wrap-up that I give to most of the chapters. And this wrap-up in this particular instance is the emotional summation of a philosophy. And I think you know Ayn Rand's novel, so you have that. All right, we have a few minutes now. We take questions on anything. I don't care on anything. No, I don't think you could. Not across a lifetime. not across a long-range course. Oh, he wants to know, is it possible rigorously, thoroughly, and in every implication to obey one virtue while violating another? And I said, no. What I do think you can do, out of context and for a period, is obey some and cheat on others. But the ultimate end result has got to be that you're continuously undercutting, since compromise works to the welfare of the evil, you're undercutting the strength and consistency of the virtue, and you're going to finally end up, if you don't change, giving up and cheating on all of them. So, for instance, in shorthand, you could on the surface decide, I'm going to have complete integrity absolutely 100% of the time, but I won't work. To hell with production. Well, it's going to be pretty soon in a position where you're at the mercy of somebody else, and they want you to do something, to say something, preach or defend some idea that you don't believe. You say, well, I have to live. So, you see, I'm just giving you an example. You'd have to chew any example, but they all are interconnected. And it's basically, your question, therefore, is like asking this. Could I remain absolutely faithful to 5 and 5 equals 10 while rejecting that 6 and 7 is 13? For a while, until somebody, puts the two of them together and says, what do you think of 3 and 2? And then Well, you are misinterpreting her statement. Yeah, well, you're misinterpreting her statement. There's 3 different levels. We're talking about the statement from Ms. Rand on the top of 295. Ethics provides a code of values to guide man's choices and actions. The choices and actions that determine the purpose and the course of his life. He says, don't the purpose and the course of your life come first, and then they determine the choices and actions? Well, there's 3 levels. First of all, you begin as a blank slate. And you have to say to yourself, what is my goal, and what kind of course of life will bring me to it? That's the choice that you're making at the outset. And her answer would be, well, you have to decide to choose to live and to accept reason. That's the choice that precedes. Gives you then your basic value, your purpose, and way of life. But now that you have a purpose and a course, what do you do concretely? If you're going to be productive, what are you going to be productive at? If you want to express love, to whom? You see what I'm saying? So then every day you've got continuous choices and actions governed by the purpose and the course, governed by your abstract code of values. So you have to choose your ethics, which then governs your daily choice. That's what I take her as meaning. Well, I think I'll pass that one. Okay. What page are you? 388? Okay. Oh, you want to defend Schoenberg? Go ahead. When he was young. Yes, I know that. Schoenberg, he's saying, wrote some very nice things when he was young. If I'm not mistaken, he went to the same school as my favorite operatic composer, Emmerich Kalman. Didn't they both go to the same school together? I'm pretty sure they did. And then Kalman continued to write beautiful music till he died, and Schoenberg went reputable, in quotes. Yes, no, I do believe, Schoenberg, what you're saying about him. Yes. It's immoral to work in a job you hate if you have an alternative. If you are working as a college professor and you really hate it, and there is a job available as a ditch digger which would be commensurate with your abilities, you'd be out in the fresh air, and you would be able to see the results of your work on a daily basis. Then it is immoral to stay teaching in college. Now, you should not have a family of 12 before you make this decision. But now, no one can say, don't keep a job you hate. That would be an intrinsicist dogma, if ever I heard of it, because you have to remain alive. So the question is only, try to find a work you like, and try to find a way of preparing for it. And if you have to go through on the way, period, where you hate what you're doing, grin and try to get through it. Now, Ayn Rand had jobs that she hated. And she worked at the RKO wardrobe for 3 years, and she hated it passionately. And as a matter of fact, so far as I understand, she cried a great deal. Not on the job, but when she came home, because she knew what she had to write, she just had no time to do it. I don't mean a great deal, but once a week. So she had jobs she hated, and she was capable of really hating a job. The Fountainhead does not make any such statement. It's directed precisely at people who defend the necessity of hating your job. And that is the moral versus the practical, and that is the true hatred of life, to spread such a doctrine as the necessity to go through life hating what you do. Can you imagine how many kids are maimed by the very idea that life is suffering? You should hate what you do. I mean, that is really tooey. So a college professor saying that in the hearing of students, I regard that as a felony, let alone a fallacy. Thank you very much.